You're listening to Season 2 of Medscape's In Discussion series on Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis, a podcast where thought leaders and clinical experts share their diverse insights and practical ideas for optimizing patient care. This series is hosted by Dr. Jeff Swigris, pulmonologist and professor of medicine in the Center for Interstitial Lung Disease at National Jewish Health in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Swigris specializes in the clinical care of patients with interstitial lung disease and directs research centered on how interstitial lung disease affects how patients feel and function in their daily lives, how to best measure those effects, and how quality of life may be improved for patients suffering from interstitial lung disease. Relevant disclosures can be found with the episode show notes on Medscape.com or the Medscape app. The topics and discussions are planned, produced, and reviewed independently of advertisers. This podcast is intended only for you as healthcare professionals.
Hello, I'm Jeff Swigris. Welcome to Season 2 of the Medscape In Discussion podcast series on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Today we have a really great topic, and I'm excited to talk to our guest, who's going to be educating all of us on circadian rhythms in IPF. Let me introduce Dr. Isaac Sundar. Dr. Sundar is an associate professor in the Department of Internal Medicine, Division of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City. Isaac, welcome to the Medscape In Discussion podcast.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm glad to be part of this podcast.
Tell us what piqued your interest in interstitial lung disease and how circadian rhythm may actually play a role there.
I started as a postdoctoral fellow in lung biology, trying to understand basic mechanisms that are related to COPD pathogenesis. My interest with respect to circadian rhythms came from the preclinical models of COPD. We did some initial studies with circadian clock, coupled lung cellular functions and COPD. In 2010, that's the initial stage where we started our studies. And then that slowly evolved over time. We moved on to understand the basic mechanisms like how circadian clock regulates inflammation, how it regulates specific cytokine signaling processes, how it affects lung function in COPD, and then potentially also some other mechanisms like DNA damage repair, senescence mechanisms that drives the pathobiology of COPD over the time. And then we started looking at a little bit on the context of what is the similarities or understanding that we know from the models of lung disease to patients with COPD, because we know that patients with COPD have nocturnal symptoms and then severity that are time dependent. So trying to really tie up to the role of clock in the lung functions. So we thought there could be a lot of things that clock is doing, not just regulating the biological processes that drives disease. They also do a lot of physiological role in terms of regulating a lot of physiological processes that drive these disease process. So then we moved on to asthma. That is my own independent research that I passionately started as an independent faculty to look into the understanding of clock and asthma pathobiology. That also ties back with clock because asthma is also linked with a lot of nocturnal symptoms and severity, and a lot of immune cells play a very important role in a time-dependent manner in regulating asthma pathobiology as well. So that drives a lot of interest to me that it's not just COPD or asthma, rather these clock dysregulation or circadian rhythms as a whole have a very broad role in a lot of chronic inflammatory lung diseases. That's where we thought expanding that to not just asthma and COPD, but rather I think ILD, not much is known. So potentially there is a lot to explore in that angle to look at what is clock really doing at the cellular level and in the physiological level, how they are changing and then how they are really contributing to the pathobiology of interstitial lung disease.
What a fantastic career in a journey through chronic lung disease. Before we really dive into ILD and circadian rhythm and clock and the potential effects there, let's level set. So remind all of us what we're talking about. When we use the term circadian rhythm or circadian clock, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, so if you think about the basic biology, people term the circadian rhythms as the natural process that regulates the sleep-wake cycle and behavioral and physiological responses in our body that are changed over every 24 hours, and it comes in a cyclical manner. So that's the circadian rhythms. But I think circadian rhythms play a very profound role in regulating a lot of things. One is the sleep-wake cycle, but apart from sleep-wake cycle, it also regulates a lot of physiological processes and biological functions such as inflammation, body temperature, metabolism, and several other hormonal responses within our body are regulated in a very timed fashion. So I think this timing is very critical, like when they are peaking, when they are troughing, when they have to really be present, when they have to be absent, very important in terms of dictating the physiological processes that are normally functioning in our body. And we think they get dysregulated during disease. We know that these hormonal regulations, temperature in our body, the lung function, or many other physiological processes like metabolism and inflammation and immune response, all these things get dysregulated because of these imbalance in the timing.
I see. There's sort of a central regulatory clock for our whole body, but then individual organs also have their own clocks. Is that right?
Yes. So the first study about the clock in the lung was published in 2009. So this 2009 study first identified the presence of these clock molecules in the bronchiolar epithelial cells of the lung, the Clara cells, which play a very important role in the airways of the lungs. And then we all know that the clock genes are not just present in the lung in one cell type, rather than every cell types of the lung have their own clock genes and they have their own function. And they maintain their normal homeostasis in terms of regulating their functional readouts in those cell types. Understanding the clock, not just in one cell type, in different cell types of the lung is where we need more insight, because currently there is no much information on how these clocks are different in different cell types and how are they contributing to the overall clock function in the lung.
So can we bring that into the discussion of interstitial lung disease? I recognize there are a limited number of data here, but if we think about what normal clock mechanisms are at work and normal timing of different things in the lung, what is aberrant or what is abnormal, if we know, in the clock mechanism, in the clock genes in interstitial lung disease?
In terms of perspective, I would like to say what I know and what we know from the literature. I think you have a very interesting thing that not much is known in the space, but we do know something. And where are we at in terms of understanding the role of clock in interstitial lung disease? Currently, we know that when we say clock dysregulation, the alteration in clock genes that over time can be either upregulated or downregulated. We know that from our existing literature that these clock genes are not in sync with their normal regulation, which means they are not rhythmically seen as you see in a normal lung. Rather, in ILD, you see an exaggerated rhythms or you see a dampened rhythms at specific time of the day. It's very important that these clock genes are altered in a time-dependent manner. So we need to be very careful when we look at animal samples versus the human tissue or outcomes that are measured in human samples. From the snapshot of what we see in animal models, we can easily time them because we can conduct studies using one time point versus another time point. So you can understand whether clock dysregulation is altering these genes in a level higher to what they are normally or lower to what they are normally. But in the disease context, it's very complex because the tissue samples are not collected all at the same time. We do know from the single cell data from IPF and ILD clearly showing that not all the cell types are significantly affected in terms of clock genes or their proteins, but there are specific clock genes and proteins are affected in specific cell types of the lung. I would say that the type 2 cells of the lung, the AT2 cells and the lung fibroblasts are the predominant cell types which are profoundly affected at the cellular clock level in these tissues. And I think potentially understanding what is clock doing in these type 2 cells, what is it doing in the fibroblast, and how they are different in the normal versus disease could provide us a better insight in terms of understanding how clock genes play a very important role in regulating some specific biological processes and functions within those cell types that drive the pathobiology of ILD.
So I'm going to get in a minute to if those genes are dysregulated, what patients might do to potentially turn those back to normal function. But first, let me ask you, do you think that dysregulated clock genes in the lung potentially play a role in the progression of interstitial lung disease and fibrotic lung disease in particular? Or do you think the dysregulation is a manifestation of the fibrosis being present?
It's a very good question, but I think it's very complicated whether this comes first or that comes first. It's very easy to say, but in a cellular model that you can clearly perturb the cells and say that when you perturb the cells with TGF-beta, and then you look at the responses, you can say that TGF-beta mediated EMT or FMT is dysregulating clock function. But in the context of a disease, there are so much complex signaling already driving this disease process. For example, inflammation, oxidative stress, extracellular matrix remodeling, and things like that. They all are simultaneously happening in a complex cellular system. That makes it more complex to say whether the altered clock comes first or whether those things drive the disease, then comes the alteration of clock. I would say it goes hand in hand. Either altered cellular processes drives circadian dysregulation that also contributes to the pathophysiology of these phenotypes. And I would say the other way around also, if you disrupt the clock and you treat them with certain agents that can activate certain signaling, then you can also perturb that to cause the disease process.
Very complex, for sure. You're more on the basic side of research. I'm much more on the clinical side. And if we're going to try and bring this line of inquiry into the clinical realm, what do you think are some important studies or steps that we need to take to improve our understanding of clock and clock genes in patients with ILD? And then we could bring that data to bear on therapeutic maneuvers. Lay out the roadmap here, Isaac, if you would, for us.
Yes, definitely. So I think it's a very complex roadmap because we are in two different phases. There are basic biologists working in one aspect of it in terms of understanding the disease process using complementary animal models and preclinical models that are very important to understand the disease process biology and how you could intervene this biology by using some therapeutics and stuff like that. But when we talk about patients, it's even more complex that you can do the sampling in patients so as to better understand how clock biology or biomarkers of circadian rhythms can be used as a prognostic marker or a diagnostic marker or even a predictive marker of the interstitial lung disease. So I think we need to see how, as basic researchers and clinicians, can work together to have a framework of putting this into perspective to identify models that can be translationally relevant. We know this ILD is a aging-related complex chronic lung disease. So we need to use complementary aging-related animal models that are resembling what you see in terms of patients with ILD. So that models could help us understand how this disease progression is happening, what is the role of clock in this disease process, can you really modulate clock function, and can you better understand the disease process, or can you reverse this disease process completely, or to what extent can you prevent the disease process? The other side of it, when you look at patient perspective, I still feel like we should be thinking about coming up with some realistic timelines to see how we could do timed sampling at least 1 or 2 time points at the specific time of the day and trying to look at the circulatory biomarkers that are relevant clock biomarkers to say, can we learn anything from these disease as they are progressing? Initially, where are these biomarkers expressed? And how are they different as the disease progresses? And to a later stage, how are these disease markers the same or they are changing over time? So I think those kind of understanding will give us a better insight in terms of whether these clock markers drive this disease or they are just a consequence of the disease that we already see. I think these understanding will really help us in terms of moving this to the next level to bring our understanding both from the clinical perspective as well as from the basic science perspective to put together how we could develop novel therapeutics. I don't think a single drug could be a way to solve this complex disease. Potentially, we need to think about complex multi-drug therapies. In a way, a clock modulator combined with a fibrotic drug could be a potential way to look at it. we need to start thinking about, because clock modulators are profound in regulating specific biological processes and functions. When you combine these two things, maybe it could have a better efficacy in providing long-term beneficial health effects in terms of reducing their mortality rates, and then expectancy of the life will be further increased in terms of using these kind of approaches as we take it forward.
Absolutely. And I think most clinical experts in the ILD field would agree with the statement that the complexity of fibrosing interstitial lung disease is going to necessitate multiple drugs in combination, inhibiting multiple different pathways. Up to this point, I don't think many people have thought about altering clock and medications that might alter clock genes. So that just opens up another avenue, certainly worth pursuing. I'm sure you would agree with that. Does the circadian clock wane as we age? Do we know that?
Yes, there are some studies from preclinical models at least have clearly shown that over time, the rhythmic expression of these genes are getting blunted. So trying to really implicate that as we age, our clock is also aging in some way in terms of affecting their functions and outcomes. So potentially that will have a direct role in these age-related lung disease.
If we looked at the general population, if clock is dysregulated, I mean, you mentioned sleep and hormonal manipulations and exercise. Are there things that we know that we can do in terms of lifestyle modifications that will turn a dysregulated clock mechanism into a regulated clock?
That's a very interesting question, but I think at least from the preclinical model perspective, the literature supports that if we can do like exercise endurance, if you perform some kind of regulated feeding regime, and then fasting feeding and trying to have a timed administration of even drugs given in animal models, have been shown to have a very profound role in regulating those processes. So I still do feel like having a very good sleep-wake cycle and then having a very good exercise pattern tailored to the need of the patients, depending on their illnesses, might be a potential way to look at how they could regularly have a schedule of sleep-wake and then regularly exercise and also diet. We all agree with that fact that food is our medicine. So I think even having a proper food that is balanced, tailored to the needs of the patient and their health status will also really have a profound role in regulating the normal function of the circadian rhythm in our body that will also influence the progression of disease in terms of slowing the progression of disease and then enhance the cellular functions that drive the protective response in our body to mediate protection against those chronic inflammatory lung diseases.
Well, I'm a big proponent of time-restricted eating, and I know that there are various definitions of that. As a clinical researcher who knows very little about nutrition science or the effects of time-restricted eating or feeding, it just makes sense to me that putting what I term metabolic stress on fibroblasts, these sick cells in fibrosing interstitial lung disease, fasting puts some sort of stress on those cells that, again, in my naive view, they don't like it. It just seems like it would be something potentially beneficial for patients with lung fibrosis. You mentioned diet. I mean, are there foods that we know are better for clock regulation or types of diets that we know are bad for clock regulation?
So if you think about the ones which are good in terms of maintaining the regular sleep-wake cycle, the foods that give you a good hormonal balance, those foods that really make you go to sleep at the right time, not like having caffeine, not like having alcohol during the night, those kind of things will affect your hormones that have to peak and trough at specific time of the day so as to regulate your sleep-wake cycles. So I feel like if we have a very good lifestyle in terms of having good fibers, good vegetables, good fruits, and then those which are rich in antioxidants and stuff, we already know that they already help us in terms of regulating our normal sleep-wake behavior. So I think influencing those forms of food in our regular practice would really help us in terms of having the regulation of sleep-wake, and that could profoundly influence all the processes that are regulated by our circadian rhythms and the outcomes that comes following these.
Before we wrap up, I want you to just get really theoretical and hypothetical for us, just based on your gut. And I want to remind listeners, this is not based on absolute human science or phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled trials or anything. But what does your gut tell you about what patients with lung fibrosis ought to be doing in terms of their lifestyles to best regulate their circadian clock?
As you cautioned, definitely it's not fully validated science that we are talking here, but potentially it will have a profound role in terms of their overall health and well-being. I still feel like if they have a good sleeping habit and then the regulated time of physical activity when it is needed, not like every day, every time, rather than tailored to the needs of the patients. And then the exposure of light is very important in terms of entraining our body to that physical environment. I think is equally important in terms of maintaining the daily routine over time. That ultimately will have a very good impact in our well-being as both of us, not just the patients, but also people like us who would like to have a very healthy lifestyle should like to practice these things. And I think they will definitely have a profound role in regulating the circadian rhythm.
Outstanding. Does it make sense that drugs, whether for lung fibrosis or any other condition, should work better or should be administered at certain times? Do we know about that?
We know that from the point of COPD and asthma, that specific administration of corticosteroids or bronchodilators at specific time of the day have more profound influence in regulating those exacerbations as well as the inflammatory outcomes that they see in patients. Potentially, not all drugs are going to work effectively when given at any time. We need to learn from those existing literature from the chronic lung disease where there are studies specifically tailored to the needs of patients and given at specific time of the day in terms of intervention and what they learn from that. If we take those lessons, if we can try to implement something in our ongoing studies and future clinical trials in terms of administering the existing drugs that are used for the treatment of ILD, I think we could still learn whether these are the ways to go in terms of giving the drug at specific time when it is needed to regulate those processes that are robustly regulated in our body could be having a profound role in controlling those processes, thereby having a protective response.
Absolutely fascinating. We have talked to Dr. Isaac Sundar, who educated us all about the topic of circadian rhythms and the circadian clock and its vital role in regulating sleep-wake cycle, hormonal balance, nutrition, and so forth. He reminded us that we have so much more to learn with respect to the role of the circadian clock in fibrosing interstitial lung disease. He talked to us about a roadmap for the future in terms of research and how we might begin to think about and integrate either medications or lifestyle modifications that could potentially regulate a dysregulated clock in fibrosing interstitial lung disease. Many more questions than answered, but a fascinating topic nonetheless. And Isaac, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure having you here today.
Thank you very much for having me here and happy to share my ideas.
And thank you all for tuning in. Please take a moment to download the Medscape app to listen and subscribe to this podcast series on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. This is Dr. Jeff Swigris for Medscape in Discussion.
Thanks for listening to Season 2 of Medscape's In Discussion Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis podcast series with our host, Dr. Jeff Swigris. Be sure to look for more In Discussion episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Check out Medscape.com or the Medscape app for show notes, links, and more information on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis.